So speaking of this Texas shooting, 10 dead, a 17-year-old junior walked into the school wearing a trench coat in 88-degree weather and was carrying a .38 pistol as well as a shotgun, I believe is the latest. He got those guns from his dad. It was legal for his dad to own the guns. There's been some discussion over whether the dad should be held legally liable for allowing the son to get into the gun safe. I think that's a little bit tough. It's a little bit tough when the kid is 17 because you've taught your kids to use the guns. You want your kids to be able to know how to defend the house when you're not there. The reality is that barring red flags, there are certain of these incidents that are going to be very difficult to prevent unless you actually harden the barriers around these schools. I've been saying for literally years at this point that kids at schools should be guarded like we guard banks or like we guard an airport. Okay, the fact is that there's no reason why, I went to a private school. We had hard barriers around our private school. You had to check in, you had to be buzzed into the school, and we had, for a school of maybe 300 kids, we had 5 or 6 different security guards who were armed on the school premises. It seems to me this should be the very least that we can do for our public schools as well. I promise if you had 20 or 30 armed security for 1,500 students, it would be a lot better than if you had 4 or 5, just because there are too many gaps in the security. Plus, you actually have to have a hard security barrier. Metal detectors would be useful. Listen, if this sort of stuff is going to continue to happen, we do need to guard our schools better. There's a very good piece by David French, who's good on these topics over at National Review, in which he writes about Malcolm Gladwell's theory that the reason that that it seems like we're seeing an uptick in school shootings right now is because the barrier to entry for school shootings has become so much lower. The barrier to media coverage is lower now. With each individual shooting, it looks like it's becoming more common, and so people think that it's happening a lot. Even though statistically speaking, it's really not happening particularly much. 22, the CNN was reporting there have been 22 school shootings this year. That's a lie. There have been something like 5 or 6. Each one of those an individual tragedy and an individual horror, an individual act of evil. But the point that Gladwell is making is the more common these things appear to be, the more common they will become. And that means that we have to do what we can to deter these things from happening in the first place. One thing that certainly does not help, it does not help in any way, is the language that you see thrown around in political with regard to these sorts of issues. So Bernie Sanders, who's just awful, the socialist senator from Vermont, he says that it is unspeakable for Congress to do nothing about gun violence.
Have you guys done enough?
Unspeakable.
Have you guys done enough in the Senate?
Of course not. Of course not. But it's like every other issue. The American people are united, overwhelmingly, gun owners, non-gun owners, on common sense gun safety legislation.
Okay, everyone is united on all these things, except for when you get down to the brass tacks of it, people are not united on these things. When people hear gun show loophole, they say, we oppose the gun show loophole. When they hear that means that every private transaction that happens in the United States is basically barred unless it goes through a gun store. Then people suddenly say, well, hold on a second. I want to give my gun to my kid. Why can't I do that without going to a gun store? So here's part of the problem. Now, I was on a radio show the other day in a major metropolitan area. And one of the hosts on that particular radio show was saying, why can't Congress get things done? Why don't they seem to care? Why don't they care? And I said, well, have you ever met these legislators? Have you ever met these legislators? She said, yes. And I said, well, did that person seem like an evil person to you? Like a really dark and evil person? And she said, no. I said, well, what makes you think they don't care about dead kids? There's this disconnect that happens when we label people and we don't actually make clear whom we are talking about. The number of people in Congress who legitimately do not care about school shootings, I would put it 0. Even people I disagree with politically. I do not think there are a lot of people in Congress who legit don't care about school shootings, who sit around every day and they go, you know what? If 100 kids have to get shot, then fine. 100 kids get shot. I do not think that that's the case. I think there are significant disagreements on policy, and these disagreements on policy are important and have ramifications, which is why we need to talk them through. But what is not useful is creating this broad class of people, this group of faceless, nameless people, and then you say, well, Congress just doesn't care. Republicans just don't care. The NRA, they just don't care. How many people who say the NRA are terrorists have ever talked to an NRA member? How many people who say that NRA members don't care about dead kids have ever spent time with NRA leadership? And when my friend Dana Lash is talking about the measures she thinks are useful in preventing school violence and gun violence at schools, does anyone really think, anybody who spent time with Dana really think that Dana doesn't care about kids who are getting shot on campuses? And yet this is used as such a convenient club, and it completely undermines and destroys our politics. If you actually believe that the people you're talking to have no sympathy for you whatsoever, it makes it incredibly difficult to come to a deal. And it's also not true. It's just not true. Now, the reason that I mention this is not just because this is in the news, but because there's another story in the news today that I think is being completely miscovered. So the Pope Francis, he apparently told a gay man that God loves him during a private meeting. Okay, so this is according to the UK Sun. In a private dialogue, the pontiff is understood to have told Juan Carlos Cruz, a victim of sexual abuse at the hands of Catholic priests, that God loves gay people and it is fine to be homosexual. The comments are the most striking public acceptance about homosexuality ever made by the head of the Roman Catholic Church. The remarks were made during a private meeting at the Vatican between the pair, in which the Pope offered a heartfelt apology. So Cruz was a victim of a pedophile priest named Fernando Caradima. Caradima is aged 87. He was found guilty of sexual abuse by the Vatican in 2011. Cruz claims his suffering was ignored by a number of Latin American bishops who used his homosexuality to brand him a liar when he spoke out. And then speaking to the Spanish newspaper, Cruz said, the Pope told me, quote, Juan Carlos, that you are gay does not matter. God made you like this and loves you like this, and I don't care. The Pope loves you like this. You have to be happy with who you are. Okay, so let's make clear a distinction. Religious people of all stripes love gay people. Okay? Religious Jews, I know gay people. There are people in my life who I'm close friends with who are gay. Okay? I love a lot of gay people. And what they choose to do with their own lives, from a governmental perspective, is their business. Does this mean that I think that homosexual activity is not a sin? No, I'm a religious Jew. Of course I believe it's a sin. But a religious person, including the Pope, can believe that homosexual orientation could be implanted within you, and also believe that homosexual acts could be a sin and still love you for who you are. Okay, I love that the left has attempted to say that if you think homosexual sex is a sin, that therefore you hate gay people. These two things are not related. These two things are not related. And this goes right back to that original argument that was being made about guns, which is just because you disagree with someone about activities that people ought to engage in or not engage in does not mean that these people are engaged in hate. It does not mean that these people hate you. And labeling them as haters is just a way for you to disregard their opinion and avoid having a conversation in the first place.